Our situation is that we are victims of or prisoners of our own involuntary doing. So if someone comes up to us and says, "You're doing it to yourself," you yourself are putting yourself in this situation where you are a slave or unfree or disconnected from reality or whatever way you might want to put it. But that's no good saying that because we don't know that we're doing. It's involuntary, and it's not only involuntary, it's completely um, unconscious to us. We have no way of seeing that we're doing it. So if you do come up to me and say to me, you're doing it yourself, that doesn't mean anything at all to me because I don't perceive myself as doing it, i.e. spinning the web of my thoughts or spinning the web of my personal narrative or spinning the web of how I see the world. I see it as a brute fact that is being imposed on me, so it's being done to me. Reality is something that's being done to me rather than vice versa. And so, because that is such a primary perception, we can't go beyond it, or at least we can't go beyond it very easily. So the basic idea is that we are doing this thing the whole time, and we can talk about it in terms of creating a positive reality. Positive means that it's defined or that it's emphasized or that it stands out, just as anything that you kind of create by pushing forward one part of the page or sheet of metal or whatever it is and pull back everything else to make what you've just done stand out. You're emphasizing it and you're de-emphasizing everything else. So that's how the positive reality gets created. And we can also talk about it in terms of spinning the continuum of logic wherever we go. So I'm sitting here and I'm spinning away, spinning this continuum of logic, which is what I take to be reality, what I understand to be the world. It isn't because, obviously, if I'm spinning it myself, it can't be reality. It's a construct of mind. It's not reality. It's not like I'm creating reality, even though sometimes we might think we are. What we're doing is creating positive reality, which isn't reality, but which has more of a claim on our attention than reality itself, which is a negative phenomenon. It doesn't exist by virtue of emphasizing anything or asserting anything or defining anything. It's what exists before we assert what exists or state what exists. So beforehand, in the beginning, there's negative reality in which nothing is stated, in which nothing needs to be stated. What's the big deal? Why do I need to go shooting my mouth off and asserting things or stating things? What the hell's wrong with me that I think I need to do that? Just spoiling a good thing if I do that. And remembering that when I do assert something, I do so by repressing everything else, de-emphasizing everything else, so that what I've just said stands out as having some kind of reality or merit on its own, which it doesn't. It only seems to be something because I've cut off all other ways of looking at things. So then I seem to have actually created something that is a reality in itself rather than the illusion of something which I've created by limiting my way of looking at things, or by de-emphasizing everything else in reality, so that you just have the one narrow description of how things are, and no other descriptions are allowed. So positive reality is created by repression or denial or putting on the blinkers, or however else we might want to say it. But then there's a kind of a glitch there. So if we talk in terms of spinning the continuum of logic, it's a sticky thing. It's a sticky web, like a spider's web. I get stuck to it because once I've done that, I've denied everything else in order to be able to do that, and then I can't access anything else to move away from this very limited picture of the world that I've just created. So as a result of this clever trick, I get stuck in the positive reality that I've created. And I really am stuck in the positive reality that I've created, because in the positive reality bubble, not only is there the world that is being definitely asserted as being definitely or literally true, there's also the sense of self that relates to this positively defined reality, and that is a positive self. It's a positively defined self, which is also created by the system of thought, or by the continuum of logic. So the system of thought creates the positive world that we relate to, and it creates the positive self, which is how we relate to that world. So it does the two things at the same time. It has to, because you can't have one without the other. You can't have a positive world without there being a viewpoint to see it, and you can't have this viewpoint, which is the positive self, without having a positive world to look at, a world that is made out of literal statements, definite statements of fact. If we were somehow to take the self and take it away out of that system of thought into the negative reality where nothing is asserted as being definitely true, which, as I say, also involves the other message that everything else is definitely not true. So that's how the polarity of the positive world works. By asserting very strongly that a certain thing is true, we're implicitly denying that any other interpretation or way of looking at things is true. So we've done this thing, and we're stuck in the positive bubble, because, as I was just saying, or trying to say, the self, if you take it out of that bubble, it can only define itself instead in terms of structures, in terms of logical assertions, in terms of rules, in terms of facts. Without anything like that, if it's just surrounded by uncertainty, it cannot verify itself. It cannot send out, it cannot interact with the world in such a way that it gets feedback about itself, saying that yes, you exist, or yes, your way of looking at things is the right way. There's no feedback like that, and so it cannot persist, it cannot exist without that, what is essentially an act of checking up on itself. So the self only exists by virtue of this act of continuously checking up on itself via the framework, in terms of the framework which it itself has created. So that's a funny old thing, and we're not really saying anything different, only just saying the same thing in a different way. But I can't check up on myself in the negative reality because it gives me no validation. There's no rules in it, there's no standards in it that say, yes, you're right, you exist according to our criteria regarding what it means to exist. There's no criteria for anything like that. So what I do is I create a positive reality, which is specifically tailored so that I can check up on this set of standards, or this reference system of reference, so I can check up on it and check that I exist. And I can do that by using the system of thought, or by using the framework. It allows me to check up, but the downside of it isn't real because I've projected it myself. So I've created myself by a spinning and the system of thought, and then using the system of thought's representation of the world to relate to, compare myself with, and check up on myself to show and prove, yes, I definitely exist. Now, the game that I'm playing isn't just that I definitely exist, it's because there's two sides to it. I can exist in a way which is pleasurable, I can exist in a way which is miserable. So, in other words, I can exist as a winner or a loser. I can exist as a person who's succeeding in this task, which we've said is all important, or I can exist as a person who's failing at this task, which we have said within the terms of the positive reality is all important. So there I have two ways of existing, the euphoric and the dysphoric way. Needless to say, this isn't real existing because it's done via a trick. I'm going to the bank and I'm borrowing some euphoria, and so then I get to feel that I'm existing in the right way. And then later on, I pay back what I've borrowed, and the paying back is dysphoric. So then when I'm paying back, I'm existing in the dysphoric or painful way. So not only does the self-construct have to exist within the system of thought and nowhere else, the only form of existence that there is, in inverted commas, pseudo-existence or virtual existence, is in alternating euphoric and dysphoric fashion, i.e. pleasure and pain in equal amounts. So that's the deal that I've signed up for. And because of the nature of the deal, because it's not a very good deal, one, it takes place within an unreality, which we can't see to be an unreality, and two, we spend just as much time having a rotten time as we do having a good time. And if we try very hard to maximize having a good time, all that means is later on it's going to come back at us even harder. And we might get very, very good at playing the game. But even so, it's not real well-being that we're chasing. It's the well-being of this idea of myself. And because I'm pretending that this idea of myself is who I am, and that's my trick, and because when I do that I can have a good time and say, yeah, I exist. Not only do I exist, but everything's great. But because that is a pretense, I have to pay back the bank at some point or other, because I've borrowed some euphoria and I have to pay it back in dysphoria. I have to pay back the bank. So that's not great. And what happens is that the situation deteriorates in such a way it becomes less and less fun to be in it. To start off with, there's the illusion that I'm getting something for nothing and that I can get euphoria without dysphoria. But as time wears on, there is a tendency for the addiction to the false self to become less glamorous, and for the true nature of my situation to reveal itself. So we might say, well, why is there this process whereby the glamour wears off and I get to see the grim reality? Why should there be such a process as a deterioration of the apparent glossiness of the life of the self-concept? And one good answer to that is just to say, well, eventually the truth comes out. And if the truth didn't come out, it wouldn't be the truth. The truth always comes out because it's the truth, because that's the nature of the truth. So we've got two things here: truth versus the fiction. And the fiction can overcome the truth, or it can blot it out or distract us from it for a good while. So it has a short-term possibility of a short-term win. But we know that eventually the truth is going to come up trumps by virtue of the fact that it is true. That's a pretty hard thing to beat. It's a really tough one to beat, because at the end of the day, it's just, well, that's what's true. What can I do? The real never ceases to be, as I think it says somewhere in the Bhagavad Gita. It's got that going for it. But the only thing about the real, which has an awful lot going for it, whereas the fiction doesn't have anything going for it, really, it just pretends that it has something going for it, is that the real is not a favourable or kind place to the self-concept. So the self-concept really, it can only exist when there is no perception of the real, when the real does not manage to reach us. So I'm spinning this web the whole time, and there's a reason I'm spinning it, because if I don't spin it, if I don't spin doctor reality for myself the whole time, if I don't spin the system of thought for myself the whole time, I, as the self-concept, the self-construct, the ego, whatever you want to call it, will get intimations of my own unreality. And as far as I'm concerned, that's pretty shit. I don't want to get intimations of my own hollowness or unreality. On the contrary, what I'm looking for is validations of my absolute reality. I'm looking for that. I'm looking for validation. I'm looking for the security of validation. I want the universe to say to me, yes, you exist. And at the end of the day, I don't even care if the universe says to me, yes, you exist, but you're a loser, because I'm still existing. That's what I really want. And even if I am existing as a loser, maybe I can one day I can turn it around and exist as a winner instead, which is the up and down cycle of samsara: pleasure and pain, euphoria and dysphoria, validation and devalidation of the false idea of who I am. So it's all on this false basis. But because the game deteriorates, so it's like saying, because I'm no longer getting the high off the drug that I used to get, and it's more a question of just dependency or need rather than having a great time, which is the honeymoon phase, as we all know. So the honeymoon phase wears off. It wouldn't wear off if it was based on truth, but it isn't based on truth. It's based on our hopeful projections, our fantasy, the self-construct's fantasy that it really can validate itself or be validated or prove its existence in a way that can never be doubted in any way. And it has such huge belief that it can do this, hopeful belief. Hope springs eternal to the self-construct, and so does despair in equal amounts. So because the shine wears off, things get tighter and tighter. So my attempt to self-validate very quickly rebounds on me and creates the opposite effect, so I get pain instead of the satisfaction and pleasure that I'm looking for. So it's like I do the thing which always works to validate me, and then it immediately comes back at me and devalidates me. I try to be happy and I make myself sad straight away. So this is what the game degenerates into, because the opposites get less and less separated. So when I say yes, there's no time lag where that yes can seem to me like a yes with no, like a yes on its own, a unipolar yes, an up with no down. So in the beginning of the game, when everything's great, I can have that illusion by asserting yes, and it's like, yes, the yes really is a yes. I've said yes, and the yes resounds, and I can believe it, and I get to be a complacent, happy, smug ego, believing in its own reality. But later on, that moment of relief, that moment of what the self likes so much, which is euphoria, becomes vanishingly small and instantaneously turns into devalidation or dysphoria. So then we find ourselves in the explicitly counterproductive realm of neurosis. So the game is no longer any fun. The game is actually a nightmare. Not to say that it wasn't a nightmare all along, it's just that we didn't see it was a nightmare, because it sucks us in by pretending to be capable of giving us something that it never actually could have given us to. But once we're sucked into it, then because we're so identified with the self-construct, we think we have no possibility of realizing that this is merely a pretense that I've got trapped in. Well, I do have the possibility of knowing that, but not until I've paid back what I owe. As Jung says, I have to pay back what I owe down to the last penny before I can get out of the hole that I'm in. Naturally, I'd like to have some kind of therapy that will get me out of there, like a ladder, where I don't have to climb out bit by bit, paying off every little bit that I owe. I'd like to get out scot-free. Hope springs eternal to the self-concept, but that just isn't going to happen. What does help is not doing. But not doing isn't what we think it is. Not doing really comes down to not spinning the system of thought, not creating the positive reality. But before I can not do, I have to see that I am doing. And that doesn't come so easily.